Walter Elias Disney, the person, was born on December 5, 1901, but Walt Disney, the personality, was born on October 27, 1954, with the premiere of the television show Disneyland. To help fund his theme park, Walt and his brother Roy entered an agreement with the television network ABC. ABC agreed to help finance the park on the condition that Walt would create an anthology series for the channel. This turned out to be a lucrative deal for both parties. On top of the funding, Walt had a platform to promote the park. The Disneyland show would showcase some of Disney's old animations and films, as well as present new content. The key element that would elevate this anthology series was Walt himself, who would host the program. While he had performed on screen in specials and events before, this would be his first consistent role as a television personality, and the immediate power of his charm cannot be overstated. The Walt Disney character was warm, funny, and all around calming. It was the mentor-like figure that Walt had always wanted to be for his animators. He had become Uncle Walt. But Uncle Walt could project more than just tranquility. The personality could also exude excitement. Excitement for Disneyland's future, and the future in general. Through his television show and his park, Walt was positioning himself as a futurist, arguably the most prominent and influential of his time.
There's a product where the past becomes today, where forgotten memories come back to stay, a place where nothing ever goes quite as planned. If this makes you curious, then we suggest Defunctland. Defunctland, the show about the past of the future.
It's the 1950s, and the United States of America is making babies. Nothing gets a country collectively going in the bedroom quite like winning a war. Soldiers returned from World War II ready to put some figurative buns in the oven, and to remind their wives to put some actual buns in the oven. Millions of women had entered the workforce to assist in World War II, but as men returned home from the conflict, they expected women to return home and stay there. The long-accepted idea that a woman's place was in the home was an admittedly tough sell after that woman had spent the past 3 years building P-51 Mustangs, but it wasn't impossible. Along with the baby boom, there was a housing boom in the US, as families moved from the city to newly built suburbs. This helped bring back the idea of the homemaker, which was reinforced by an entire genre of media.
She met Chad at the university in a math course. She got the better grades. Now he's an engineer, and she's a housewife.
Faster manufacturing practices, new materials for goods, and a thriving economy meant new products were being pushed on Americans like never before, and companies from General Electric to Monsanto were showing the public their ideas for the modern home. This abundant optimism was helped by the fact that the US was one of the only global powers not rebuilding after the war. Rather, the country was more equipped than ever to succeed. With a reinforced social structure, a booming economy, a new standing as the premier global superpower, and about 10 years before its massive social unrest would need to be addressed, the sky was the limit for the United States of America. But even that wasn't enough, because many people had their targets set on the stars. On March 22, 1952, the weekly magazine Collier's published the first in a series of articles titled "Man Will Conquer Space Soon." It was one of the first prominent and extensive speculations on the real-world possibility of space travel. It also positioned the prospect of sending humanity to space as a destiny of sorts. Space was not just another frontier to conquer, but it was, as the magazine put it, the last frontier. This sense of optimism and purpose was supplemented by prominent scientists, all of which came together to formulate a rough plan for space travel using their expertise and the available knowledge. At the forefront of this team was rocket scientist and ex-Nazi Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had joined the Nazi Party and assisted in the war effort, designing the V-2 rocket, a missile that would kill nearly 10,000 soldiers and civilians. Worse, the rockets were built through forced labor from concentration camp prisoners, and more prisoners would die building von Braun's rocket than the rocket would actually kill. Von Braun knew and witnessed this horror, but being powerless to stop it, continued his work. Von Braun claimed afterwards that he was apolitical, and he simply wanted to continue his passion, a boldly apathetic response to the question, "Why were you a Nazi?" Von Braun asserted that his biggest dream had always been to send humans to space, not to design weapons. In 1944, after getting properly drunk at a party, he mentioned this dream, along with the fact that he believed Germany would lose the war. The Nazi Party did not appreciate the sentiment, and after hearing of the remarks, von Braun was arrested and held for 2 weeks. Hitler himself had to reinstate von Braun to his position, but von Braun now knew that he had to escape. which apparently had not yet occurred to him. Still, he waited until May 2, 1945, the day after Hitler was killed. Von Braun and a few members of his staff were able to surrender to Americans, and within months, von Braun was working for the U.S. Army under the program Operation Paperclip, designed to recruit German scientists to the U.S. and away from the Soviet Union. His relocation was eventually revealed to the public, and he became a prominent and predictably controversial figure throughout the late 40s and early 50s. However, the ideas presented in Collier's would become so popular that many Americans' introduction to von Braun was through these visions of space travel, many never learning that he was a Nazi, others not caring. However, there were still some that took issue.
Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun.
Von Braun's V-2 rocket would be the basis for the proposed spaceflight, and one of the team's main conclusions was that if humanity was to go to space, it would be on a rocket. Collier's article series transformed the way Americans thought about space travel. A trip to the moon went from fantasy to a real-world possibility in just a few short years. Walt Disney was among the convinced, and he had not just an opportunity to promote von Braun's vision, but a need. Walt's anthology Disneyland show would be split into 4 categories to reflect his park: Fantasyland, Adventureland, Frontierland, and Tomorrowland. Each week, Disney would present a program from one of these areas. The Frontierland shows would feature old Disney films such as So Dear to My Heart, and new content such as the enormously popular Davy Crockett series starring Fess Parker. The Adventureland shows would feature Walt's true-life adventure nature documentaries, and Fantasyland would of course showcase some of his classic animations. However, Walt had little to nothing to present on the show's Tomorrowland programs. In fact, the first 19 Disneyland shows would be presented from everywhere but Tomorrowland. Walt assigned his friend and animator Ward Kimball, one of his only close collaborators that was not wrapped up in the building of Disneyland Park, to direct one of the Tomorrowland programs. It was decided that the show would be on space travel, and Kimball reached out to von Braun, asking him if he would be willing to present some of the information he published in the Collier's articles on the Disneyland show. Recognizing the power of the platform, von Braun agreed, bringing his colleagues and their collective knowledge onto the program. The first Disneyland Tomorrowland episode, titled Man in Space and directed by Kimball, would premiere on ABC on March 9, 1955.
In our modern world, everywhere we look, we see the influence science has upon our daily lives. Discoveries that were miracles a few short years ago are accepted as commonplace today.
The special stood as an antithesis of sorts to the space sci-fi genre common in theaters at the time. These alien invasion films were campy and dystopian, while the von Braun Disney view of space travel was researched and optimistic. More than anything, the Man in Space Disneyland special captured the values and aesthetic that Walt wanted for Disneyland Park's Tomorrowland area. However, by the time the special premiered, Walt had realized that Disneyland's Tomorrowland would not live up to his dreams. With Mickey Mouse Park, a potential spaceship attraction was thrown around, but no dedicated future area was included. In the original 1953 Disneyland pitch less than a year later, an area dedicated to science and the promise of tomorrow was added. Named the World of Tomorrow, this land would invite the forward-thinking industries of the mid-1950s to an exposition space that resembled the popular World's Fairs of the day, specifically the 1933 Century of Progress Fair in Chicago and the 1939 Golden Gate International Exhibition in San Francisco, both of which Walt had visited. Guests would enter the World of Tomorrow via a moving sidewalk. Inside the area was to be a mechanical brain, a diving bell, a suspended monorail, submarines, a flying saucer, a children's car ride, and a voice-controlled house of the future. There was also plans for a futuristic restaurant, in which, quote, conveyor belts will carry your food through the electronic cooking device of tomorrow, where you will see it cooked instantly to your liking. The area's signature attraction was to be a rocket spaceship to the moon, which would simulate scientifically accurate space travel. The proposal lauded the land's authenticity and values. As Disneyland would evolve, so would the World of Tomorrow, eventually being renamed Tomorrowland by 1954. However, as with the Tomorrowland segments of the Disneyland TV show, the Tomorrowland section of Disneyland Park would be the lowest priority-wise. This wasn't necessarily from lack of interest, and there is no concrete answer as to why Tomorrowland was an afterthought. Most likely, it is due to the fact that the land was the one with the least amount of iterations. While Main Street and Frontierland had been planned since the initial Mickey Mouse Park concept, Tomorrowland was new to the fold, and while the other lands added in Herb Ryman's 1953 layout, such as Lilliputian Land and Recreation Land, would be scrapped, Tomorrowland remained, and it remained a problem. Practically everything was cut from the 1953 proposal, including the suspended monorail, the submarine, the house of the future, and the moving sidewalk. All the team was sure of was the rocket simulator and the children's car ride. Walt's team knew there was also to be exhibition halls for companies to showcase their products, but even this simple idea had not progressed. Disneyland had begun construction on June 20th, 1954, and Walt wanted the park open less than a year later, on Sunday, July 17th, 1955. This goal was ambitious, verging on impossible, and during the first months of construction, as the park ran over budget and construction was slower than expected, it became clear that if the park was going to open in July, something would have to give. And first on the chopping block would of course be Tomorrowland. C.V. Wood, Disneyland's general manager, begged Walt to not open Tomorrowland with the rest of the park, and instead focus on the other areas. Walt reluctantly agreed to this in September of 1954, choosing to delay Tomorrowland's opening to 1956, although some development continued on the two planned attractions. The plan was to wall off the land, with signs informing the park's 1955 guests of the land's debut the following year. This was the case for September, October, November, and December of 1954. However, as Walt presented his ABC show each week, with the promise of Tomorrowland in each intro, his anxiety over the decision to delay the area grew, and in January, he instructed his team to prepare Tomorrowland to open with the rest of the park. Of course, this meant the land, which was the least developed at the start of construction, had lost a precious 4 months of a 12-month build, time that could have been spent fleshing out the area and constructing attractions, or at the very least searching for sponsors for the World's Fair-type pavilions. Nonetheless, the construction crew got back to work on the area, and Walt's design firm, WED Enterprises, went back to the drawing board. The new plan was to construct 2 large exhibition halls to take up the majority of the land space. What would go inside of these, no one knew, but at the very least the structures would be under development. A young designer, Bob Gurr, was put in charge of the car ride, to be named Autopia. Autopia would showcase the future of highway transportation. Von Braun and his team, while developing more specials for the Disneyland show with Kimball, assisted in the design of the rocket simulator, to be named Rocket to the Moon. Wood rushed to find sponsors for the Tomorrowland exhibit space, and given that the park was less than 6 months from opening, he was taking whoever he could get. Luckily, Tomorrowland sold itself. As proved by the 1933 Century of Progress Fair and the fairs that followed, almost any company from any industry was eager to brand themselves as a product of the future, especially in the 1950s, with every new product, material, and company wanting the American public to envision them alongside the modern home. Despite the short amount of time to do so, Wood was able to secure a significant amount of sponsorships from such forward-thinking brands as Richfield Oil, Monsanto Chemical Company, and the National Lead Company, which owned Dutch Boy Paints, the lead paint of the future. Rocket to the Moon was to be sponsored by Trans World Airlines, and outside of the attraction would stand the Moonliner, a 76-foot-tall model of a rocket, taller than the park's castle, designed by Disney artists John Hench and Von Braun. WED was also working on 2 additional attractions. The first was a 360-degree film to be sponsored by General Motors named A Tour of the West, to be housed inside of a unique theater named Circarama, with General Motors products on a showroom floor. The technology for the film was in development by none other than UB Iwerks, Disney's longtime partner who had left the studio in 1930 only to return a decade later. The other Tomorrowland attraction in development was named Space Station X1, which featured detailed models giving a panoramic view of Earth from space. The space station used was similar to the one that was designed by Von Braun. Richfield Oil, who was sponsoring Autopia, would also sponsor a short film and diorama titled The World Beneath Us, which would give a history of the world and the origins of oil, hosted by a character named Mr. Professor. The Monsanto Company would host a walkthrough exhibit called the Hall of Chemistry. Kaiser Aluminum would host the exhibit, the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame. On top of this, Wood promised the company that Kaiser's aluminum would not just be in their Tomorrowland exhibit, it would be used in building materials throughout the park. The diversified use of aluminum was expanding throughout the 1950s, and there seemed to be no limit to this magic metal. Of course, there was one, the sun, but it was not until aluminum was added to the Moonliner rocket ship, the Autopia cars, the castle, and much more that the crew realized that aluminum expands in the heat and contracts when cooled. This meant regular maintenance on Autopia and loud groaning noises from the Moonliner as it expanded and contracted throughout the day. The entire land was rooted in modernism, although there were some early elements of what would soon be the popular space-age architecture, which featured large curves and paper-white exteriors. The land's lead designer, Italian director Gabe Scognamillo, worked with his team to fill the empty land. Tomorrowland was supposed to reflect the future in the year 1986, chosen because this was the next time Halley's Comet was to pass Earth. Additional touches to the land included bright-colored pillars as well as a state flag display known as the Court of Honor. At the entrance to the land would be the Timex-sponsored Clock of the World, which told the time of anywhere on the planet. It was no world's largest thermometer, but it would do. 2 refreshment bars were added to the land, the Space Bar, which served in a unique automat counter-service hybrid, and the Yacht Club, named for its proximity to the Tomorrowland Lagoon, on which guests could captain small boats, which showcased new fiberglass technology. It was a rushed job, and Walt was disappointed with the lack of speculative future in the exhibits and attractions. But with only a few weeks before the park's July 17th opening, this was the least of his concerns. Even with the less-than-ideal exhibits, Tomorrowland was not nearly ready. It appeared that the area's signature attraction, Rocket to the Moon, the one with the tallest icon in the park luring guests towards it, would not be ready in time for opening day. Despite multiple sponsors, the exhibit spaces were far from full, and it was still uncertain if the refreshments bars would be completed. Walt's main concern was the exhibit spaces, which were visibly and embarrassingly empty, especially the one to the south. In a desperate attempt to fill the room, Walt asked his team to set up props from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the popular live-action film that Disney had released the previous year. Unfortunately, many of the props were destroyed or had degraded, so new ones would have to be built, meaning that not even this quick fix would be ready on opening day. Given the circumstances, it was inevitable that Tomorrowland would not be complete, but it now seemed that it would be a miracle if it was open at all. In the final days before the opening press event, crews worked through the night to ready the park, and the team was able to complete enough of the land to open it to guests. Despite many of the Tomorrowland attractions and exhibits being roped off on the morning of July 17th, Walt planned to give his park guests and his television audience, at the very least, a glimpse of Tomorrowland.
Oh, hello. Well, how do you do, Professor Haber? Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you a gentleman of considerable renown. This is Dr. Heinz Haber, and I'm sure you will remember him from Walt Disney's Tomorrowland. Go ahead, Doctor. Please tell us about it.
Bob, I must just explain to these kids that I have here an atom of uranium.
I see.
But of course, it's only a loaded mousetrap.
It is.
Your suspicions are correct. That man was also a Nazi.
I'd like to read these few words of dedication. A vista into a world of wondrous ideas, signifying man's achievements. I thought I got a signal.
Opening day Disneyland was a disaster, but everyone knows that. What's important is not what went wrong, rather what went right. What was actually open in Tomorrowland on July 17th, 1955. As guests entered the land, they would be immediately greeted by the Clock of the World and the two main exhibit spaces. The left, or north exhibit space, was the most complete. This building held Circa-Rama and the Tour of the West film, which some reports claim was not playing until the following day. The north exhibit space also contained Space Station X-1 and Richfield Oil's The World Beneath Us. The exhibit space to the right, or south, only held the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame and the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry. The 20,000 Leagues exhibit was still under construction, as was the back of the exhibit space, which would soon be filled by more temporary sponsors. As guests continued into the land, they would pass the Court of Honor, with 48 state flags arranged in a star, with the American flag raised above all. At the back of Tomorrowland, guests could view the Moonliner ship and see the exterior for the Rocket to the Moon attraction, which was not yet completed. To the left of Rocket to the Moon was the Space Bar, which was serving on opening day. To the left of the Space Bar was Autopia, which would be operating for the press and guests. Next to Autopia was the Tomorrowland boats, which some reports claim were not functional despite a segment of the opening special being filmed in front of the lagoon. The adjacent yacht club was not finished in time for opening. Roaming Tomorrowland was the Tomorrowland Spaceman, dressed in tubes and sporting a fishbowl helmet. There would be many iterations of the Spaceman throughout the years, and he would most often roam the land talking to children, sometimes selling balloons. He would soon be joined by the Tomorrowland Space Girl, and the two would roam the land as the Tomorrowland Space Couple. And that was opening day Tomorrowland. It was not a lot, but it was certainly better than nothing. With the opening day event out of the way and a steady stream of revenue from day guests coming in, Walt and his team went to work finishing the partially built Tomorrowland attractions and planning additional ones. Rocket to the Moon would be finished within the week, opening on July 22nd. The 20,000 Leagues exhibit would be completed 2 weeks later, opening on August 3rd. In September, the Art Corner, a small gift shop in a temporary location near Main Street, moved into the North exhibit in Tomorrowland, further reducing the amount of empty space. This store was themed to the streets of Paris and would sometimes show up on maps as such. Jack Olson, a Disney artist who worked on studio merchandising, made the brilliant decision to sell Disney animation cells in Art Corner, rather than just throwing them away. This turned Art Corner into a popular shopping destination, despite having absolutely nothing to do with Tomorrowland or the future. In the middle of the land, a circular stage named Flight Circle was placed, for Wenmac and later Cox Manufacturing model planes, cars, and even boats to be showcased. When Flight Circle was added, a makeshift store named Hobbyland opened next to it, where models could be purchased. Around this time, the Tomorrowland boats, which had been a nightmare for maintenance, were updated and renamed to the Phantom boats, although the fix, which included covering the boat's engines to reduce smoke, unsurprisingly would not reduce maintenance issues. In January of 1956, the boats would be docked, seemingly for good, but after failing to come up with any alternatives, the boats were up and running again by the summer of 1956, just to close for a final time in the fall, again because of maintenance issues. Tomorrowland continued to be updated in Disneyland's second year. Additions included the American Dairy Association's Dairy Bar. Located in the South Exhibition Space and contained in a structure resembling a barn, guests could view exhibits of the future of dairy farming, as well as drink cool, refreshing glasses of milk that go down smooth on a warm California day. Also in the South Exhibition Space would be the Crane Company Bathroom of Tomorrow, the ribbon cutting of which featured Walt and executives from the Crane Plumbing Company turning large water valves. The exhibit was actually one of the more futuristic offerings in the land, considering that it speculated the future of bathrooms, although it was merely a display and no functional toilets were available, which had to have confused a few guests navigating the park using the guide map. In March of 1956, the National Lead Company's exhibit would finally be installed, named Our Future in Colors, where guests could view and try different paint combinations. The two biggest Tomorrowland attraction debuts of 1956 were the Astrojets and the Skyway. The Astrojets was a spinning rocket ride that took the place of the Court of Honor flag display, which would be relocated into the Avenue of Flags at the entrance to the land. The Astrojets would open in March of 1956. The Skyway was a gondola lift that would transport guests between Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. The Skyway would open in June of 1956. Both of these attractions added to the kinetic energy of the land, but Tomorrowland still lacked the futurism that Walt had envisioned and that he was presenting on the Disneyland show. His frustration would lead him to nickname the area Todayland, other times Yesterdayland. He was determined to fix this. In 1957, the Yacht Club was moved and renamed to the Yacht Bar in preparation for a new train attraction named the Viewliner Train of Tomorrow. The unique train, designed by Gurr, would circle around the Tomorrowland Lagoon with a station in both Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. The Viewliner, combined with the Disneyland Railroad, Frontierland's Mine Train through Nature's Wonderland, and Fantasyland's Casey Jr. Circus Train, brought the park's total amount of trains up to 4, which thrilled Walt because he loved the number 4. The train would not fix Tomorrowland's futurism problem as much as the other 1957 edition, the Monsanto House of the Future.
Would I like it? What a dream. Imagine how wonderful it would be to live in a house like this. Just imagine. I'd be getting dinner in this kitchen.
If you want more light, press a button. Any intensity of light through polarized plastic ceiling panels.
Oh, it would be wonderful. Well, maybe someday.
The recent mass production and implementation of plastic, along with the nationwide housing boom, led Monsanto to envision a home made entirely of the material. They then presented the concept to Walt, hoping to create a functional model of the home as Monsanto's second Tomorrowland attraction. Considering Walt had just approved of an exhibit that was literally people watching paint dry, it is no surprise that he jumped on the opportunity to bring a true speculative future attraction to Tomorrowland. The original plans for the World of Tomorrow had mentioned a home of the future, so the Monsanto exhibit was the first step in bringing Walt's true vision of Tomorrowland to fruition. The plastic house would not just be innovative in its use of materials, but it would also feature a unique layout and speculative home features. The attraction opened on June 12, 1957, situated near the entrance of Tomorrowland. The attraction would be a massive success, and it would become an image of futurism throughout the late 50s and early 60s. Still, Walt had bigger plans for Tomorrowland. He wanted to resurrect two additional concepts from the original World of Tomorrow pitch, the monorail and the submarine ride. And after a trip to Switzerland to shoot the film Third Man on the Mountain, Walt also wanted a bobsled attraction inside of a scale model of the Matterhorn, not dissimilar to the Rutschbahn, the historic coaster that Walt had viewed at Tivoli Gardens a few years prior. Throughout 1957 and 1958, plans were drawn for Disneyland's first major expansion with these three attractions in mind, all three of which would be located in between Tomorrowland and Fantasyland, with all three being designated as Tomorrowland attractions. In order to make room for the new rides, the Viewliner Train of Tomorrow closed in September of 1958. Also that September, the American Dairy Association closed their Dairy Bar exhibit, and other exhibits for the area were planned. Along with the three new major attractions, an entirely new land was proposed for Disneyland, to be located in the area between the South Exhibition Space and Rocket to the Moon. The new land, to be named Science Land, sometimes referred to as a new pavilion named Adventures in Science, was to include a time travel attraction where guests could view scenes of dinosaurs, a ride called Microworld where guests would be shrunk down and travel inside of a drop of water, and another space attraction, this one showcasing scenes of not just space travel, but space colonization. The new pavilion would not come to fruition, at least not in this form, but the Matterhorn, Submarine Voyage, and the Monorail would. The $5 million expansion was announced in December of 1958, and in just 6 months, all three attractions were operating, all opening on June 14, 1959. These rides, the first to be given the coveted e-ticket designation in ticket books, would be hugely popular for Disneyland, and in an instant would transform Tomorrowland from an incomplete land of temporary exhibits into the most well-rounded and thrilling of all. Still, even with this monumental and hugely popular expansion, the exhibit space still troubled Walt. In December of 1959, the world beneath us closed. Soon after, Space Station X-1, which had been renamed to the Satellite View of America, closed as well. Both were replaced with a new exhibit to coincide with Art Corner named The Art of Animation, which would show displays from upcoming Disney animated films, which in a way was more about the future than Art Corner. Also in 1960, the Bathroom of Tomorrow and the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame were closed and replaced by fun photo spots. To be clear, that was the name of the photo areas, not an endorsement. In 1961, the space once earmarked for Science Land would become home to another new Tomorrowland ride, the Flying Saucers, referred to as the bumper cars of the future, another Bob Gurr contraption. The guest-controlled saucers gliding on top of air valves would be problematic for maintenance, but would continue to entertain when not broken down. In 1962, Trans World Airlines dropped their sponsorship, and the Douglas Aircraft Company took over. The Moonliner was updated to reflect the change. In 1963, the Dutch Boy Color Gallery closed so that the Circarama Theater could be expanded. In 1964, the Astrojets were renamed to the Tomorrowland Jets, as American Airlines had recently started using the term Astrojets for some of their planes. In 1965, Monsanto would host a third attraction in the South Exhibit Space, a display named Fashion and Fabrics Throughout the Ages, that told the history of fashion and fabrics throughout the ages. The exhibit would only last a few months. It was around this time that Walt and the Disneyland team would first realize an issue with Tomorrowland that would eclipse concerns of temporary exhibit spaces and non-futuristic attractions. The Tomorrowland problem, as it would later be named, was that any grounded vision of the future will eventually come. Ironically, the man that had inspired much of the land would be the same that would help render it obsolete. In 1957, the Soviet Union had launched the satellite Sputnik 1. The following year, the United States would establish NASA, and none other than ex-Nazi Wernher von Braun would lead the US in the escalating space race. Now, in the late 60s, with manned spaceflight achieved and a moon landing imminent, even the most optimistic parts of Tomorrowland were becoming a reality. An overhaul was needed, and in 1966, Disney and his crew began drafting plans for a new Tomorrowland. While the Matterhorn, the Monorail, and Submarine Voyage would remain unchanged, the rest of Tomorrowland would be walled off, with a model of the new ambitious plans placed outside the walls for guests to view. This meant that the Clock of the World, the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, the Monsanto House of the Future, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit, the Flight Circle, Hobbyland, Art Corner, the Art of Animation exhibit, the Tomorrowland Jets, the Flying Saucers, Fashion and Fabric Throughout the Ages, Rocket to the Moon, the Yacht Bar, and the Space Bar were all closed for good for New Tomorrowland. Most were dismantled and removed, while a select few would be refurbished into new attractions. Tomorrowland 1955 was gone even quicker than it was constructed, but its impact on Walt and the public would live on. Tomorrowland 1955 would not make Walt into a futurist figure overnight. In fact, more was done to establish Walt's visions in the Disneyland Anthology series than the park. Throughout his career, Walt had traded in nostalgia. The future was a new creative space, but the principles of simplicity and optimism that made Walt's vision of the past digestible were the same that would make his vision of the future effective. Whether it was the lofty promise of space travel or the foreseeable future of the suburban home, the answer was the same. American ingenuity and industry would lead the way. And in a time of post-war prosperity for a large portion of the population, who could argue with that notion? Still, Tomorrowland 1955 was just the beginning of Walt's visions for the future. His biggest ideas, the ones that would label him a visionary, were still ahead. For in between Disneyland's opening and the original Tomorrowland's closure in 1966, Walt Disney had formulated grander ideas for tomorrow, and had taken them, not to Anaheim, but to New York City.
Thank you, Garco.